"Open this door, Theodora. This house belongs to my husband." The voice, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the pre-dawn silence. It was 6:14 in the morning, and I was already awake, sitting in the heavy stillness of my living room, a cup of long cold coffee cradled between my palms. I was waiting. I knew she would come. After yesterday, after I had finally gathered the tattered remnants of my dignity and presented them with the eviction notice, I knew my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, would not go quietly. But I hadn't anticipated this. Not Locksmiths. Heavy footsteps thudded on the porch I had scrubbed on my hands and knees just 2 days prior. Male voices, low and businesslike, murmured outside. Then, the unmistakable, sickening clank of metal tools against metal. Rebecca had not come to plead or negotiate. She had come with professional backup to breach my home, to force her way into the sanctuary I had bought, the house I had bled for, sweat for, wept for, over 35 agonizing years. "Ma'am, we're private locksmiths." The man's voice was bored, automated, as if this were nothing more than a routine lockout. "We've been hired to gain entry. We strongly suggest you step aside if you are inside." For him, it was just a job. For me, it was a declaration of war. "Did you hear that, Theodora?" Rebecca shrieked again, and now her voice was laced with that familiar, triumphant venom that characterized her every interaction. "We are coming in, whether you like it or not. You should have thought this through before you dared to throw us out like common trash. My husband has rights to this property." I remained motionless, anchored in the worn velvet of my armchair. My 68 years on this earth had taught me many lessons, most of them harsh, but the most crucial one had arrived late in life. There are certain people, hollowed out by greed and entitlement, who only understand the language of profound and undeniable consequences. The assault began. First, a metallic whining, a high-pitched whir that set my teeth on edge. Then, a sharp, grating screech as the drill bit bit into the deadbolt I had installed myself a decade ago, back when I finally had enough disposable income to upgrade my security. I closed my eyes, taking a single, steadying breath, the scent of stale coffee, a bitter counterpoint to the rising bile in my throat. 35 years. 35 years of rising before dawn to catch the first bus, of cleaning sterile office buildings under the harsh fluorescent glow of midnight, my hands raw and chapped. 35 years of caring for other people's children in the mornings, loving them, nurturing them, then returning to an empty apartment, saving every single dollar as if it were my last. Sacrificing vacations I never took, clothes I never bought, simple dinners with friends I couldn't afford. Everything, absolutely everything, poured into the foundation of this one small house, this patch of earth that was mine, a place where no one could ever kick me out again, a place where I made the rules. And now, my own son's wife was on the other side of that door, employing strangers to violate it, screaming that this house belonged to him, my son, Elias, the boy I had raised alone, in suffocating poverty, after his father vanished like smoke when Elias was just 3 years old. The son to whom I had given every scrap of my being, every cent I earned, and much, much more that I didn't have to give. The son who, 8 months ago, had appeared on this very doorstep, his face etched with a practiced misery, claiming he just needed a few days, a week at most, to sort things out with Rebecca. Those few days had metastasized into 8 agonizing months, and in those 8 months, my sanctuary, my home, had ceased to be mine. It became an occupied territory. "Almost there," Rebecca's voice, sharp with victory. "Keep going. This old woman can't hide from us forever." Old woman. She wielded the phrase like a weapon, as if surviving 68 tumultuous years was a mark of shame. As if raising a child single-handedly from poverty to prosperity, as if building a life from the literal dust, was a weakness. I rose from the armchair, slowly. My knees, faithful barometers of every coming storm, protested, but I ignored their complaint. At this age, the body is a constant chorus of grievances. You learn to tune out the noise when more important matters are at stake. I walked, soundlessly on the worn rug, toward my bedroom. The drill buzzed. A furious metallic insect, closer now, screeching as it breached the last layer of security. But I was not in a hurry. I had been awake all night, meticulously planning this very moment. I knew precisely what needed to be done. I opened my closet and retrieved the canvas bag I had packed yesterday afternoon. Inside were 4 large, economy-sized bottles of generic brand ketchup. I wasn't about to waste my good hinds on this performance. Tucked beside them were old rags, threadbare towels, a dress I hadn't worn in years, and a small, forgotten jar of concentrated red food coloring, a relic from a long-abandoned attempt at baking a red velvet cake. It had failed spectacularly for the cake, but today it would serve its purpose perfectly. In the kitchen, I emptied the ketchup into a large mixing bowl. I added a generous amount of the food coloring, stirring until the mixture transformed from a bright, familiar condiment into a deep, viscous, unsettling crimson. It looked terrifyingly real. I soaked the rags, one by one, letting them absorb the thick liquid. I returned to the foyer and began to arrange the scene. I scattered the soaked rags across the hardwood floor, creating an irregular, chaotic trail leading from the door. I took my old housecoat, drenched it in the mixture, and dropped it in a heap near the entryway, as if it had been torn from someone in a violent struggle. Every detail mattered. Every stain had to tell a story. I went to the hall mirror and paused. Taking a deep breath, I uncapped one of the ketchup bottles and began. I dumped more of the sticky liquid over the shoulders of the clean house dress I was wearing, smearing it over my arms, my neck, letting it drip slowly down the fabric, pooling near my feet. I ran my hands through it and then streaked it across my face and into my gray hair. I looked at my reflection. I was a nightmare, a vision from a horror film. It was perfect. The drill stopped, abruptly. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the house. The deadbolt. It had given way. Yes, that's it. Rebecca's cry of triumph was piercing. Now, open it. Open the door. I heard the handle jiggle, then turn. Rebecca pushed, but the door held firm. I had engaged the internal safety latch, that simple, inexpensive brass chain she had mocked as paranoid when she first moved in, the one that could only be disengaged from the inside. The one she never bothered to understand because, in 8 months of cohabitation, she had never bothered to truly know this house or the woman who lived in it. "It won't open," she shrieked, pure frustration in her voice. "There's another damn lock." I heard the muffled voice of the locksmith explaining something, the limitations of his tools against such a lock. Rebecca cut him off. "I don't care what it takes. Break it. Drill through the wood. I'm paying you, aren't I?" The drill began again, this time more aggressive, more violent, aimed at the chain mechanism itself. The entire door shuddered in its frame, the wood groaning under the assault. My home, my refuge, my sacred space, being physically violated by people who had already emotionally defiled it for months. The noise was deafening, a roar of entitlement and destruction. The door trembled one last time. Just as I heard the splintering of wood, just as I knew the chain was about to give way, just as they were seconds from bursting in, I reached up, my hand covered in the sticky red concoction, and slid the chain free. With a single, steady motion, I pulled the door open. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier and more profound than any sound I have ever heard. Rebecca, poised to charge forward in victory, froze on the threshold. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, seemed to bulge from their sockets. Her perfectly glossed mouth formed a perfect O of horror, but no sound emerged. Behind her, the 2 locksmiths, one young, one older, dropped their tools. The heavy drill clattered onto the porch, its metallic thud echoing with jarring finality down the quiet, waking street. Then, the screaming began. The younger locksmith, his face instantly ashen, scrambled backward so violently he tripped over his own tool bag, tumbling down the porch steps. The older one staggered back, hands flying to his head, his voice a repetitive, panicked chant. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." Rebecca finally found her voice. It wasn't a yell, but a high-pitched, terrified wail. "Theodora, Theodora, oh God, what did you do?" I remained kneeling on the floor, precisely where I had positioned myself, a small, still figure in the center of the grotesque, simulated carnage. I was a tableau of their worst fears. I looked up, my face smeared with blood, the red-soaked house dress hanging from my frail shoulders. I didn't speak. I let them absorb the full scene, the viscous, dark red puddle spreading across the floor, the stained rags, my bloodied clothes, my wounded silence. All of it, illuminated by the cold, gray light of 6:30 a.m., looked horrifyingly plausible. Windows in the neighboring houses began to slide open, doors creaked, alarmed voices drifted across the lawns. "What's all that screaming? Is everything all right over at Theodora's?" Mr. Henderson, my 80-year-old neighbor from across the street, emerged onto his porch, clutching his cane, his pajamas rumpled. "What in blazes is this commotion? At this hour?" Rebecca, finally snapping out of her paralysis, turned toward him, her eyes wild with tears, pointing a trembling finger at me as if I were a monster risen from the grave. "Her! Look! Look what she's done! She's crazy! She's completely insane! Somebody call the police! Call an ambulance!" I rose, slowly, every movement deliberate, every gesture theatrical in its understatement. I let them see the effort it took. I braced myself against the doorframe, my small form silhouetted against the dark, bloody hallway. I looked at the small crowd gathering on the sidewalk, then at the locksmiths, then, finally, at Rebecca, and I offered a small, calm smile, the smile of someone who had anticipated every move. "You," I said, my voice clear, though I intentionally added a slight tremor, "just hired men to forcibly break into private property at 6 in the morning, without a warrant, without the owner's permission. And now, there are witnesses." The older locksmith, his face pale, blinked several times, as if trying to reboot his brain. She told us it was her house, that her mother-in-law had locked her out." I shook my head slowly, a gesture of weary sadness. "This house is in my name, and only my name." I held up a hand to forestall any argument. "I have the deeds. I have all the mortgage documents, paid in full. And you, gentlemen, were hired to break in by someone who does not live here and who possesses absolutely no legal right to this property." More neighbors emerged. Mrs. Petrov, 3 doors down, approached, holding her phone aloft. "I already called 911, she announced, her voice firm. "I heard the drill and the screaming. They're on their way." Rebecca spun towards her, hysterical. "Yes, good, let them come. Look what this woman did. She's hurt herself. She did this to frame me. She's demented." I told Elias she was demented. I simply smiled again, that same small, unnerving smile. "Hurt myself?" I asked, raising my arms, careful to keep my clean palms facing outward. "I don't have a single scratch on me, Rebecca. But you just committed a crime. You brought locksmiths to force my door after I explicitly asked you and my son, yesterday, to leave this house and not return." The young locksmith, having regained his footing, stammered, "We didn't know, lady. We swear. She showed us an ID with this address. We were just doing our job." "I know," I said, my voice softening. "And that is why I won't be pressing charges against you. But I suggest you leave, right now, before the police arrive and this becomes far more complicated for your business." They didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their tools, throwing them into the truck with a clatter, and peeled away from the curb, leaving Rebecca standing alone on my porch, trembling with a fury that had nowhere to go. Her face was a mask of crimson rage, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. "This isn't over," she hissed through gritted teeth. "Elias has rights. He's your son. He lived here. This house is his too." I leaned against the doorframe, the adrenaline fading, leaving a cold, hard clarity. Elias lived here as a child, yes. I raised him in this house, which I paid for, alone, for 35 years while I worked 2 jobs. When he turned 18, he left. He built his own life. He married you. And I continued to live here, alone, paying my bills, maintaining my space. Rebecca opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up a hand, silencing her. 8 months ago, he came to my door, begging to stay for a few days. He said you were having problems, that he needed time. I let him in, because I am his mother. Because this house will always be a refuge for my son when he needs me. But that does not make it his property. A refuge is not an entitlement. And what about me? She shrieked. I'm his wife. I left my apartment, my life, to come live in this mausoleum. Your life? I repeated, and this time my voice was sharp. What life, Rebecca? The apartment you couldn't afford? The one I was secretly sending Elias money to pay the rent on? The job at the art gallery you quit 2 weeks after you married him? You don't work, Rebecca. You have never worked. You live off my son's salary. A salary that, I recently discovered, hasn't existed for 8 months, because he was fired in February and has been hiding it from me, from you, ever since. The color drained from her face. Bullseye. Yes, I continued, pressing the advantage. I know. I know he was fired. I know you've both been living off my retirement savings, draining the accounts I built over a lifetime. I know about the credit card he opened in my name, without my knowledge. I know the mounting bills you've been ignoring are because you've been spending my money on God knows what. The silence on the street was now absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The gathered neighbors stared, transfixed by the raw domestic drama unfolding before them. Rebecca, grasping for a foothold, fell back on her only remaining defense. You never wanted me here, she stammered, her voice trembling with self-pity. From the first day, you made me feel like an intruder, like I wasn't good enough for your precious, perfect son. I shook my head, a profound weariness settling over me. I welcomed you into my home, Rebecca. I gave you a roof over your head when you had nowhere else to go. I shared my food, my space, my life. The only thing I ever asked for in return was a little respect, just a sliver of common decency. And what did I receive? You rearranged my furniture without asking. You threw away Arthur's armchair, claiming it was musty. You criticized every meal I cooked, every decision I made, every memory I cherished. You treated me like an incompetent servant in the house I own. Because this house was stuck, she exploded. It was stuck in the past. Everything was old, ugly, depressing. It needed life. It needed respect, I corrected, my voice cold and final. And that is something you are incapable of giving. The distant wail of sirens grew closer. Rebecca heard them, and a new, genuine fear flickered in her eyes. The righteous indignation was gone, replaced by the panicked realization of her miscalculation. When the police arrive, I said calmly, stating a simple fact, I am going to show them my deeds. I am going to explain that I gave you and my son formal, written notice to vacate yesterday. I am going to tell them that you returned this morning, at 6 a.m., with locksmiths to forcibly break into my home. I am going to let them see this performance. I was forced to stage to protect myself, and then I am going to let them decide what constitutes a crime. She took a half step back. Elias won't let you do this to me. He'll stop this. Elias isn't here, is he? I said, and for the first time, a note of genuine sadness entered my voice. That's the crux of it, isn't it? You came alone. You hired the locksmiths. You directed the break-in. But my son is nowhere to be found. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of impotent rage, not sorrow. He's at a hotel, she whispered, a last, desperate attempt at bravado. He's waiting for me. I told him I would handle this. Of course you did, I replied, the weariness returning. You always handle things. You make his decisions. You speak for him. You bully him. And my son, my poor, weak son, lets you, because it's easier than facing the consequences of his own choices. It's easier than facing you. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing but sirens now silent, pulled up to the curb. The neighbors parted respectfully. The older officer, gray at the temples, and the younger one, his uniform immaculate, approached the porch. They took in the scene. Me, disheveled and covered in ketchup. Rebecca, trembling on the steps. The splintered doorframe, the scattered rags. Who made the 911 call? The older officer asked, his voice calm, authoritative. I did, officer, Mrs. Petrov called out, raising her phone. Heard a drill and terrible screaming starting just after 6. Sounded like a break-in, or worse. The young officer approached me cautiously, his eyes filled with professional concern. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you require medical assistance?" I raised my arms, showing my clean, unstained palms. "I'm not injured, officer. Thank you for asking. This," I gestured to my clothes and the floor, "is ketchup and red food coloring, a necessary precaution." The two officers exchanged a glance. The older one's eyes narrowed. "A precaution against what, ma'am?" I pointed directly at Rebecca. "That woman is my daughter-in-law, Serafina. She and my son, Marcus, have been living here for 8 months, temporarily. Their stay became untenable. I have discovered they have been committing financial fraud against me, and they have been profoundly disrespectful. Yesterday, I served them with a formal, legal notice to vacate. This morning, at 6:14 a.m., she returned with 2 locksmiths to force entry into my home. My neighbors witnessed it. Mrs. Petrov even has a recording." Mr. Henderson stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "It's the God's honest truth, officer. I saw the whole thing. She arrived yelling that the house belonged to her husband, that she'd get in whether Theodora liked it or not. Brought those 2 fellas with the drill. We all heard it. A terrible racket." Other neighbors nodded in agreement, a small chorus of confirmation. The older officer turned his gaze on Rebecca, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, is this true? Did you hire locksmiths to force entry into this property?" Rebecca's face crumpled. The defiant rage vanished, replaced by a calculated, tear-soaked victimhood. "This is my husband's home," she sobbed, sinking onto the bottom step. "She kicked us out yesterday, officer, for no reason, threw us onto the street like animals. We have nowhere to go. I was just trying to get our things, our medicine." The young officer took out his notebook. "Is this property legally in your husband's name, ma'am?" Rebecca hesitated, her eyes darting, searching for a plausible lie. "He's her son. He grew up here. He has a right." "That's not what I asked," the officer repeated patiently, his pen poised. "Is his name on the deed?" Without a word, I turned and walked back into my house. I went to the antique writing desk, where I kept my important documents, retrieved the heavy, embossed folder, and returned to the porch. I handed the file to the older officer. "This is the original property deed, officer. As you will see, it is solely and exclusively in my name, Theodora Salazar, purchased in 1991. Mortgage satisfied in 2011. There is no other name on this document." The officer took the folder, examining the papers meticulously under the growing morning light. His partner leaned in to look as well. The neighbors watched in respectful silence. "This all appears to be perfectly in order, Mrs. Salazar," the older officer said finally, handing the folder back to me. His gaze on Rebecca was now cold, official. "Ma'am, you have no legal right to this property. The owner, Mrs. Salazar, asked you to leave. Your return this morning, especially with the intent to force entry, constitutes attempted breaking and entering and trespassing at minimum." "But my husband," Rebecca shrieked, jumping to her feet. "He lived here. He's her son. She can't just evict him." "Ma'am," the young officer said, his voice firm but not unkind, "if your husband was residing here as a guest of his mother, he has no inherent property rights. The owner has every legal right to revoke that privilege. Your actions this morning were illegal." "What about our things?" Rebecca cried, shifting tactics. "Our clothes, our computers, everything is in there." "Your belongings are packed," I stated flatly, cutting off her rising hysteria. "I packed them myself yesterday afternoon. 5 boxes. They are in the living room, clearly labeled. You may retrieve them now, under police supervision, and then you must leave." The older officer nodded. "That is more than reasonable." He gestured to his partner, then looked at Rebecca. "You and my partner may enter, retrieve your belongings, and that is all. You are not to return to this property without the express, written permission of Mrs. Salazar. Is that understood?" "I am." Rebecca, cornered and defeated, could only nod, her face pale with fury and humiliation. The 4 of us entered the house. The young officer, seeing the full extent of my ketchup-based deterrent in the bright light, whistled softly. "Ma'am, that's quite a setup. Definitely ketchup," he murmured, kneeling to inspect the puddle. "Creative." "Necessary," I replied curtly. In the living room, as promised, sat 5 large, neatly sealed cardboard boxes, labeled Elias and Rebecca. All their scattered belongings, the clothes they'd left draped over furniture, the expensive toiletries that had colonized my bathroom, the myriad books and electronics that had cluttered my living space, were contained. Everything that wasn't mine, everything that had represented their 8-month invasion, was packed away. Rebecca stared at the boxes, and for the first time, her expression truly broke. The anger and defiance seemed to drain away, leaving behind a raw, stunned realization. This was real. This was final. She had lost. You packed," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I did," I confirmed. "I knew you would be back. I know you, Rebecca. I know you don't accept no as an answer. I know you believe that if you scream loud enough, push hard enough, you will eventually get whatever you want." She looked at me then, tears of genuine despair welling in her eyes. "Why do you hate me so much?" I shook my head, a wave of profound, bone-deep weariness washing over me. "I don't hate you, Rebecca. I don't even truly know you. In 8 months, living under my roof, you never once showed the slightest interest in knowing me. You never asked about my life, my past, my work, my dreams. You only ever saw me as an obstacle, and this house as a prize to be won, a convenience you didn't have to earn." "I gave up my apartment for this," she cried, a last, desperate defense. "I gave up my life." "What apartment?" I asked, my voice flat. "The one you were months behind on rent for? The one Elias was paying for with money I was secretly lending him every month after he lost his job?" "Yes, Rebecca, I know about that too." Her face went bone-white. The final secret, the one that exposed their entire charade, was out. The older officer cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Ladies, this is clearly a personal matter. Ma'am," he addressed Rebecca, "I suggest you retrieve your boxes and arrange for transport. If you have further disputes, they must be settled in civil court, not on Mrs. Salazar's porch." Rebecca knelt beside the boxes, her hands trembling as she tore at the tape on one, checking the contents as if expecting me to have stolen something. The young officer looked at me, his eyes filled with a new, dawning respect. "Do you need assistance cleaning this, scene, ma'am?" He gestured to the foyer. "No, thank you, officer," I replied. "I can manage. I've cleaned up far worse messes than this." He understood I wasn't just talking about the ketchup. It took Rebecca nearly 20 minutes to rummage through every box, her movements frantic, desperate. Finally, she nodded, defeated. "It's all here." "Do you need assistance loading them into a vehicle?" the older officer asked. She shook her head, her gaze distant. "I'll call Elias. He can. He'll come get them." She pulled out her phone, her thumbs shaking as she dialed. I heard the faint ringing tone. Once. Twice. 3 times. Voicemail. She tried again. Same result. And again. Nothing. He's not answering," she whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Rebecca tried calling Elias 5 more times, the silence in the room growing heavier with each failed attempt, each unanswered ring an indictment of the man who had abandoned her to face the consequences of their shared plot. "Ma'am," the older officer said, his patience wearing thin, "we can't stay here all morning. Do you have anyone else you can call? Family? A friend?" Rebecca shook her head, looking utterly lost, all her polished certainty gone. I don't have anyone else. My family, they're in California." "My friends?" Her voice trailed off. The friends who had laughed at her jokes, who had admired her remodeled house. They were her friends by association with Julian's perceived success, a success now revealed as a lie. "I can call a taxi service," the young officer offered gently. "They can take you and your belongings wherever you need to go." She nodded numbly, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. All the fight, all the venom, had evaporated, leaving behind a young woman barely 30, who had wagered everything on the wrong man and lost spectacularly. The officer made the call. A large van-style taxi would arrive in 15 minutes. We waited in a strained, uncomfortable silence. Rebecca sank to the floor, leaning against her boxes, hugging her knees. I remained standing by the window, watching the quiet street, watching my neighbors, one by one, retreat back into their homes. The morning's drama concluded. Mr. Henderson was the last to go, offering me a small, respectful wave before closing his door. I waved back. He had seen. He knew. That mattered. How long were they living here? The older officer asked, breaking the silence, his voice low. 8 months, I replied. They arrived in March, said it was temporary, that Elias had lost his job and they needed time to regroup. And the credit card? The young officer prompted gently. I found out 3 days ago, I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. A letter from the bank, a card opened in my name, without my knowledge. He'd had access to my study, to my personal documents. He used my information. The older officer whistled softly. That's felony identity theft, ma'am. Financial fraud. You know you can press charges for that as well? I know, I said, my gaze drifting to Rebecca, who sat small and broken amidst her possessions. But he's my son, my only child, no matter how betrayed I feel. He's still my son. Rebecca looked up at that, her eyes wide, a flicker of disbelief, perhaps even gratitude, in their red-rimmed depths. She said nothing. The taxi arrived, its horn honking softly. The 2 officers, going above and beyond, helped carry the 5 heavy boxes to the curb, loading them into the back of the van. Rebecca followed, her movements stiff, mechanical. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at my house, at me. It didn't have to be this way, she said finally, her voice husky. No, I agreed, standing on my porch, the morning sun now warming my face. It didn't, but it is this way. Because you chose to force a door that was already open to you, had you only chosen to knock with respect, because you chose to scream for ownership instead of speaking with gratitude. Because from the moment you walked into my home, you saw me as an obstacle, not as the person who was offering you refuge. She pressed her lips together, a flicker of the old defiance returning, but it died as quickly as it came. She turned and climbed into the taxi without another word. I watched it pull away, watched it turn the corner, disappearing from my street, and I hoped, from my life. The officers remained a moment longer, finishing their report. The older one handed me a card. Mrs. Salazar, if you have any further trouble, any at all, you call us directly. And ma'am, he paused, his gaze compassionate. Think about that credit card. Your son is an adult. Actions must have consequences. I will, I promised, knowing, even as I said it, that I probably wouldn't. When they finally left, the street returned to its sleepy Sunday morning quiet. I closed my door, leaned against the solid wood, and only then did I allow my body to tremble. Only then did I let the full, crushing weight of the morning, of the past 8 months, settle onto my shoulders. I looked at the mess in my foyer, the sticky, drying puddle of ketchup, the scattered rags, my own stained house dress discarded on the floor. The elaborate, desperate stagecraft I had been forced to deploy to protect myself. It had worked. I had outsmarted them. I had reclaimed my home. But now, as always, I was the one left to clean up the mess. I took off the stained dress I was wearing, letting it fall to the floor. I went to the kitchen, filled a bucket with scalding hot water and strong soap. I grabbed the mop. Kneeling on the cold floor, I began to scrub, the suds turning a faint, sickly pink. I had to change the water 3 times before the tiles shone clean again. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of methodical, physical labor. 2 hours of scrubbing, rinsing, drying. 2 hours where I focused only on the task at hand, forcing my mind to go blank, processing nothing but the simple restorative act of cleaning my own space. When I finished, I took a shower, the water as hot as I could stand, scrubbing my skin until it was raw, washing my hair 3 times to rid it of the lingering, sweet smell of tomatoes. I dressed in my most comfortable, worn pajamas, even though it was barely 10 in the morning. I made a fresh, strong pot of coffee and sat in my armchair. My armchair, the one Rebecca had relegated to the attic, the one I had retrieved yesterday. It was old, the velvet worn thin on the arms, but it fit me perfectly. I sat there, sipping the hot, black coffee, gazing around my living room. It was finally, unequivocally, mine again. The empty spaces where their intrusive furniture had been now felt vast, clean, filled with possibility. I could breathe. For the first time in 8 months, I could truly, deeply breathe. My phone rang, the sudden sound jarring. I tensed, expecting Elias, expecting more drama. But the caller ID was the bank. I hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Theodora Salazar?" "Yes, this is she." "Good morning, Mom. This is Cecilia from First National Bank, Fraud Department. We're calling regarding the irregularities we discussed on the credit card opened in your name in March." My stomach tightened, a cold reminder. It wasn't over. It wasn't over at all.